VMRL, those are for the web users out there, which is a 3D interface to web pages, which was specified as you can see by the name 97. It doesn't seem to be used that much these days. It was an interesting idea at the time, but these days it's not really used that much. And you can see you've got Reactor, and this comes with a bunch, quite a few different types of helpers which are used by the Reactor dynamic system for simulating things like boxes falling down stairs, or cars crashing, or something on a spring wobbling around. You can do various dynamic simulations using the Reactor system, and all these helpers are used for that. Okay, let's move on to space warps. We have a flyout which has subtypes of space warps. The first type we have forces, and as mentioned earlier, these are used by particle systems to simulate things such as drag, gravity, wind. There's one here for doing vortices, so quite useful for doing whirlwind type simulations. And these are used a lot with particle flow, and in fact the older legacy particle systems that you can still get with Max, but generally these days, because it's so much more flexible, people usually use particle flow with Max 6 onwards. We have deflectors. Deflectors are there are various types of deflector which are suitable to different circumstances. Again, these are used by the particle system to basically make particles bounce off objects. So there's an S deflector which is a sphere deflector, and is used basically just for spherical objects. So there's a deflector which is just a plane-based deflector. Or there's the U deflector, which will work off any mesh. So you've got quite a bit of variety there in what you can do. After deflectors, you have geometric deformable. These are generally used with actual geometry objects, and they will create objects which you can use to then modify those pieces of geometry. For instance, bomb will blow the geometry apart. Wave will make the object wave around like it's made of water. Ripple will do a similar kind of thing. So yeah, you've got various deformation tools there which are actually quite useful for different circumstances, and they're very easily animatable. You have modifier based, which are basically world space versions of various modifiers that you have. These are quite an advanced feature, and it's the sort of thing that we'll come to in probably another DVD where we talk about procedural methods and working with animation in Max. We have Reactor, Space Warp, which is just water, and that's used to simulate Reactor's water system. That just creates a little helper that can be used for simulating that. And then we have particles and dynamics, and in this case we have a vector field, and I think that's actually used by I think it's Character Studio or possibly Reactor. I'm not sure. It's something that isn't used very often, but is there for when you actually do need to use it. And finally, in creation we have systems. There aren't many systems. There are bones, sunlight, biped, ring array, and daylight. The ones that you'll be using the most, if you own Character Studio, you can use biped to create a skeleton and then rig a character using that. If you don't own biped, then you'll be using bones. So let's create a bone. There we go. Created some bones there, and then you can use IK on these bones or forward kinematics to actually rotate the bones around and create characters from. So there you go. You can see there are actually quite a lot of options in the creation panel, and it's a very deep area in Max, and something which is probably worth going through and just trying out each one of these options. And something I can also recommend, this DVD is designed to get you going with Max, but something that you should probably do is actually go through the actual user reference which comes with Max, which is very good. And what you can actually do is you can go to the user reference, for instance, and do a search, and we look for space warps, for instance. Let's do space warps. Space warps. There we go. And Max produces a list of all the pages which have references to space warps, and it goes into some detail here on all the various space warps, and we'll give you a very in-depth description of what each one does. So, you know, once you've finished this DVD, please go through the online help and look at as many areas as you can and get all the real in-depth information there on each different area. It really is a very good resource. Okay, so we've looked at creation, all the different types of creation. You've got your geometry, as I said, your shapes, your lights, your cameras, your helpers, your space warps, and your systems. And once you've finished creating an object, especially geometry objects, you will then want to modify them. So we go on to the next panel, which is modify. And to show how modify works, we'll create a teapot. There we are. Create a lovely little teapot there again. And we will then go to the modify panel, and you can see that this actually shows you that you have a teapot selected. And if I go to the modifier list, it produces a list which is being in this case, which is actually a flat list, and it lists all of the modifiers that can be applied to the teapot. Now, there are a lot of different modifiers, and they can produce a lot of different effects, and this is something which is probably worthy of a DVD in its own right. But as an example, we could put a modifier onto the teapot and we could bend it. So let's go to bend. There we are, we put that on, and then we can bend the teapot. So modifying is something that you'll be doing a lot. And depending on the object, the way that you can modify it varies. So probably the list of modifiers would actually change per object. So for instance, if you have a shape object, you'll have modifiers which are specific to shapes, and so forth. So there's quite a lot of options there with modifying. Okay, then we have the hierarchy panel, and here you can see you have three options. You've got pivot, IK, and link info. The option that you'll be using the most in here is the pivot option, which allows you to get an object and then change the pivot position of the object, which is quite useful. You'll be using that quite often, where you know, the default position the pivot's put in at the beginning of the object's creation isn't necessarily where you want it to be in action. An example of that is when you model a robot's arm, and the pivot is in the middle of the arm, say the upper arm, and you actually want it to be at the end of the upper arm so that it actually pivot from that point. You'd go to here, you'd click on pivot, affect pivot only, and then you'd move the pivot to a new position. So yeah, that's quite a useful tool there. And again, which is something pretty fundamental actually to working in Max. Then you have the motion panel, which is an area that you can go to work with animation controllers, and also to work with animated trajectories. But these days the motion panel isn't used that much, isn't used a great deal, isn't quite as relevant as it was when Max was first designed, and is generally used a lot more for it's actually much better to animate using the curve editor or the other tools in Max. So yeah, this isn't actually that relevant anymore, but like I said, you can actually go here and you can assign controllers, so it does still have some functionality. But as an example, if we go here to the curve editor, you can assign controllers using the curve editor, which is a much more sort of generalized user interface, which is actually much more useful. Then we have display, which is actually used a great deal in Max. This allows you to filter out objects as they're displayed in the viewport. So you can hide geometry, for instance. You could hide all the shapes in the viewport. You could hide all the lights, all the cameras, all the helpers, all the space warps, particle systems, bone objects, and you can also add new types of objects to hide. If you want to hide a bunch of objects, let's select this object and then move it. I'm going to make some copies of it. You can actually, there we go, and we'll just make one more set of copies. Then what you can do is you can actually select a bunch of objects, and you can do hide selected, so we'll just hide those objects. I'll undo that using Control Z. You could hide unselected objects, which will actually do everything which isn't selected.